The morning mist hung heavy over London as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood before her bedroom mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she attempted to fasten a simple pearl necklace. The same necklace that had belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales, seemed heavier today than it had ever felt before. William watched from the doorway, his own reflection showing the weight of sleepless nights etched across his face. 3 months had passed since Catherine's cancer diagnosis had been made public, and today marked her first official royal engagement since completing her treatment. The decision to attend the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala had not been made lightly. Palace advisors had suggested waiting longer, giving her more time to recover fully, but Catherine had insisted. The children needed to see hope, she had argued, and sometimes hope required showing up even when you didn't feel ready. William approached quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Without words, he gently took the necklace from her fingers and carefully clasped it around her neck. Their eyes met in the mirror, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. No cameras, no expectations, no public duties, just a husband and wife who had weathered one of life's most frightening storms together. The palace staff moved through the corridors with unusual reverence that morning. Even the most seasoned members of the household, who had witnessed decades of royal ceremonies and crises, seemed to understand that today was different. This wasn't about protocol or tradition. It was about courage manifesting in its most human form. Sarah, Catherine's longtime dresser, had selected the outfit weeks ago, an elegant navy blue dress that would photograph beautifully while remaining appropriately subdued. But as she helped Catherine into the garment, both women noticed how it hung differently now. Catherine's frame, always slender, had become more delicate during her treatment. Sarah made quick, expert adjustments with safety pins, ensuring the princess would feel confident despite the physical changes her body had endured. The drive to the hospital would take 45 minutes through London traffic, giving Catherine time to mentally prepare for what lay ahead. She had specifically requested that the usual motorcycle escort be minimal. She wanted to see ordinary people going about their daily lives, to feel connected to the world beyond palace walls. William held her hand as their car moved through the city streets, occasionally pointing out small details: a street vendor arranging flowers, children playing in a park, an elderly couple walking their dog. News of Catherine's appearance had been carefully managed by the palace press office, but word had inevitably leaked. By mid-morning, crowds had begun gathering outside the Royal London Children's Hospital. Unlike the usual royal watchers with their folding chairs and Union Jack flags, this crowd was different. Parents held their children a little closer. Cancer survivors wore their awareness ribbons with extra pride, and hospital workers who had rushed out during their break stood quietly, many with tears already forming in their eyes. Inside the hospital, 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez lay in her bed, bald head covered by a bright yellow headscarf that matched her infectious smile. Emma had been battling leukemia for 2 years, and news that Princess Catherine was coming to visit had given her something to look forward to during particularly difficult treatment days. Her mother, Maria, sat beside the bed, nervously smoothing her daughter's blanket while watching the door for any sign of the royal arrival. Dr. James Henderson, the hospital's chief oncologist, checked his watch for the dozenth time that morning. A tall, distinguished man who had dedicated his career to treating childhood cancers, he understood better than most what Catherine's visit meant to his patients. He had been briefed about the princess's own cancer journey, and he felt a deep professional respect for her decision to return to public life by visiting children facing similar battles. The hospital's main lobby had been transformed for the occasion, with artwork created by young patients displayed on easels throughout the space. Each piece told a story of hope, fear, courage, and dreams that extended far beyond hospital walls. A 10-year-old boy named Marcus had painted a picture of himself playing football, his hospital gown replaced by a bright red jersey. 7-year-old Sophie had drawn her family together under a rainbow, with the words "after the storm" written in careful, childish letters across the top. As Catherine's car approached the hospital, she could see the crowds gathered outside. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the faces, not of curious onlookers seeking a glimpse of royalty, but of people who understood struggle, who recognized courage when they saw it. Some held handmade signs with messages of support. Others simply stood in respectful silence, creating an atmosphere of collective hope that seemed to envelop the entire street. William squeezed her hand gently as the car came to a stop. "You don't have to be perfect today," he whispered, echoing words he had spoken to her countless times during her treatment. "You just have to be you." The car door opened and Catherine stepped out into the London morning air. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Not the usual cheers and excitement that typically greeted royal appearances, but something deeper and more profound. Applause mixed with quiet sobs, and many people simply stood with their hands pressed to their hearts, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of admiration, empathy, and shared understanding of life's fragility and strength. Catherine paused for a moment, looking out at the gathered faces, and something shifted inside her. The nervousness that had plagued her all morning transformed into determination. These people, survivors, caregivers, families touched by illness, healthcare workers who fought battles every day, they weren't here to judge her appearance or critique her performance. They were here to witness courage, to be part of a moment where vulnerability and strength existed side by side. As she walked toward the hospital entrance, Catherine's steps grew more confident. The trembling in her hands stilled, and the princess who had spent months focusing on healing began to remember the profound impact of service, of showing up for others even when showing up felt impossible. Behind her, William followed, his own emotions barely contained as he watched his wife transform before his eyes from a woman recovering from illness back into the beacon of hope she had always been for so many. The hospital's automatic doors whispered open, and Catherine stepped into the warm, antiseptic-scented lobby, where dozens of young patients, their families, and medical staff waited in anticipation. The silence that greeted her was profound, not empty but full of unspoken emotions that seemed to charge the very air around them. Hospital Director Margaret Walsh approached first, her professional composure barely masking the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Catherine had requested that the visit be as informal as possible, with minimal speeches and ceremony. She wanted to spend time with the children, to listen to their stories, to offer whatever comfort her presence might bring. But as she looked around the lobby at the faces watching her, some hopeful, some weary, all touched by the reality of serious illness, she realized that her presence meant something entirely different than she had anticipated. 9-year-old David Chen sat in his wheelchair near the window, his Star Wars pajamas a bright splash of color against the medical equipment that surrounded him. He had been in the hospital for 6 weeks following complications from his brain tumor surgery, and his parents had barely left his side. When Catherine approached his chair and knelt down to his eye level, David's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that can only come from a child who has learned to find happiness in small moments. "I heard you like Star Wars," Catherine said softly, noticing the lightsaber toy clutched in his small hands. David nodded enthusiastically, launching into an animated explanation of his favorite characters and scenes, seemingly forgetting for a moment where he was and why. His mother, Lin Chen, watched the interaction with amazement. It had been weeks since she had seen her son so animated, so much like his old self. Catherine listened intently as David explained the complex relationships between Jedi and Sith, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite royal courtesy. When he finished his explanation, she leaned in closer and whispered, "You know, I think you're as brave as any Jedi I've ever heard about." The simple words, spoken with complete sincerity, caused David's chest to swell with pride, and his parents exchanged a look of gratitude that transcended any formal thank you. Moving through the ward, Catherine encountered story after story of remarkable resilience. 12-year-old Amelia Parker had been painting watercolor landscapes during her chemotherapy sessions, each piece more beautiful than the last. Her artwork showed a technical skill that impressed even the adults who viewed it. But more than that, it radiated a peace and acceptance that seemed impossible for someone so young, facing such enormous challenges. "I paint what I want to see when I get better," Amelia explained, showing Catherine a particularly stunning piece depicting a meadow filled with wildflowers. "Mom says we can visit places like this once my treatment is finished." The hope in her voice was infectious, and Catherine found herself making a mental note to ensure that Amelia's wish might somehow be granted. William, following a few steps behind, watched his wife navigate these interactions with growing admiration. He had seen her natural empathy countless times before, But witnessing her connect with these children while dealing with her own recovery created a profound sense of awe. The way she listened, truly listened to each child's story, the way she remembered details they had shared and referenced them later in conversation, the genuine laughter she shared with them over silly jokes and observations. The hospital's teenage patients had gathered in the recreation room, and their reaction to Catherine's arrival was markedly different from the younger children. These young people, aged 14 to 18, understood more fully what cancer meant, what treatment entailed, and what the future might hold. Their applause was respectful but reserved, their expression showing a complex mixture of hope and skepticism that comes with facing adult realities while still being children. 16-year-old James Morrison sat apart from the group, his arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable with the attention and ceremony. He had been battling osteosarcoma for 8 months, and the aggressive treatment had forced him to abandon his dreams of playing professional football. When Catherine approached him, he looked up with unconcealed challenge in his eyes. "I suppose you're going to tell me everything happens for a reason," James said, his tone carrying the anger that often accompanies profound loss at such a young age. The room fell silent, other teenagers shifting uncomfortably, unsure how the princess would respond to such direct confrontation. Catherine sat down beside him, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Actually, I was going to say that sometimes life is just really unfair, and it's okay to be angry about that," she replied quietly. "I've been pretty angry myself lately." Her honesty caught James off guard, and for the first time since her arrival, his defensive posture softened slightly. They talked for nearly 20 minutes about anger, about loss, about the strange way serious illness could make you feel simultaneously older and more vulnerable than your years. Catherine shared her own struggles with accepting help from others, with feeling like her body had betrayed her, with the fear that accompanied every medical appointment. James listened with growing attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed a maturity forced upon him by circumstances no teenager should face. When their conversation ended, James stood up and, to everyone's surprise, asked if he could take a photo with Catherine. As they posed together, he whispered, "Thanks for not pretending it's all going to be okay." Catherine smiled and whispered back, "Thanks for reminding me that being real is more important than being perfect." The nursing staff, initially nervous about having royal visitors disrupt their carefully maintained routines, found themselves drawn into the warmth that Catherine's presence seemed to create throughout the ward. Senior nurse Patricia Edwards, who had worked in pediatric oncology for over 20 years, observed the interactions with professional interest and personal amazement. "In all my years here," Patricia later told her colleagues, "I've never seen the children respond to a visitor the way they responded to her. It wasn't because she was a princess. It was because she understood their journey in a way most people can't." The validation that Catherine's presence provided to both patients and families was palpable, creating an atmosphere of shared understanding that transformed the typically clinical environment. As word spread through the hospital about the visit, staff members from other departments began finding reasons to pass through the pediatric ward. Janitors paused in their work, administrators left their offices, and doctors adjusted their schedules to catch glimpses of the princess who had returned to public service while still carrying the vulnerability of her own recent battle with cancer. The afternoon was stretching longer than originally planned, but no one seemed eager for the visit to end. The afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows as Catherine made her way to the family lounge, where parents and siblings of patients had gathered. This room, typically filled with whispered conversations and worried glances, had taken on an entirely different atmosphere. Mothers who had been carrying impossible burdens for months sat straighter in their chairs. Fathers who had learned to hide their fears behind stoic expressions allowed themselves moments of genuine emotion. Maria Rodriguez clutched her daughter Emma's hand as they waited for the princess to reach their corner of the room. Emma's yellow headscarf had been carefully adjusted 3 times, and her mother had spent the morning helping her practice what she wanted to say. But as Catherine approached their small group, Emma's carefully rehearsed words disappeared, replaced by a spontaneous burst of excitement that made everyone in the room smile. "Princess Catherine, I painted you a picture," Emma exclaimed, holding up a watercolor depicting a woman in a blue dress surrounded by flowers and butterflies. The technique was charmingly childlike, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. This was Emma's vision of hope made visible, her way of transforming fear into something beautiful. Catherine accepted the painting with the kind of reverence usually reserved for priceless masterpieces, studying every brushstroke with genuine appreciation. "Emma, this is absolutely beautiful," she said, her voice carrying authentic amazement. "May I ask you about these butterflies? They're so colorful and seem to be dancing around the flowers." Emma's face lit up as she launched into an explanation about how butterflies represented transformation, something she had learned during one of the hospital's art therapy sessions. The nurse said that caterpillars have to go through something really hard to become butterflies, and that made me think about getting better. Sometimes you have to go through hard things to become something beautiful. The wisdom in those simple words, spoken by an 8-year-old who had spent more time in hospitals than playgrounds over the past year, created a moment of profound silence in the room. Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of recognition. This child had articulated something that Catherine herself had been struggling to understand about her own journey. "Emma," Catherine said softly, "I think you might be one of the wisest people I've ever met. Would it be okay if I kept this painting? I'd like to put it somewhere special where I can look at it and remember what you taught me today." The interaction rippled through the room, touching every parent who watched. Susan Matthews, whose teenage son had been fighting lymphoma for 2 years, found herself thinking about transformation in ways she never had before. The endless medical appointments, the sleepless nights, the fear that had become her constant companion. Perhaps all of this struggle might be leading toward something she couldn't yet see. William observed these exchanges from his position near the doorway, marveling at his wife's natural ability to find profound meaning in seemingly simple conversations. He had accompanied her on hundreds of royal engagements over the years, but this felt fundamentally different. This wasn't about duty or obligation, this was about healing, both giving it and receiving it. Dr. Sarah Collins, the hospital's child psychologist, had initially worried about how the patients might react to having their struggles become part of what could be perceived as a public relations opportunity. But as she watched Catherine interact with the families, those concerns evaporated. The princess wasn't performing kindness for cameras or creating memorable moments for news coverage. She was simply being present, offering the gift of her genuine attention to people who rarely felt seen by the outside world. The conversation with Emma had opened something in Catherine, and her interactions with the remaining families took on an even deeper quality. She sat with Mrs. Patterson, whose 5-year-old son had been undergoing treatment for 18 months, listening as the exhausted mother described the challenge of maintaining hope day after day. Catherine didn't offer empty reassurances or platitudes about everything working out for the best. Instead, she acknowledged how difficult it was to keep believing when the road seemed endless. "Some days," Catherine admitted quietly, "I had to borrow hope from other people. My husband, my children, even strangers who sent letters. It's okay if you can't manufacture hope on your own every single day." The permission to not be strong every moment, coming from someone who understood the weight of public expectation, provided Mrs. Patterson with a relief she hadn't experienced in months. As the afternoon progressed, news of Catherine's visit had begun spreading beyond the hospital walls. Social media posts from families and hospital staff, carefully worded to respect privacy while sharing the emotional impact of the day, were creating ripples throughout the country. The hashtag #Courage and Kindness began trending, filled with messages from cancer survivors, healthcare workers, and ordinary citizens who felt moved by the images and stories emerging from the hospital. But inside the hospital, the focus remained intensely personal and immediate. Catherine had requested to visit the intensive care unit, where the sickest children received treatment. This was not part of the original plan. Palace security and hospital administration had both expressed concerns about the emotional toll such a visit might take. However, Catherine had insisted, explaining that these families, dealing with the most critical situations, might need support most of all. The ICU was quieter than the other wards, filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle whoosh of ventilators. Catherine moved through this space with even greater reverence, understanding that here, hope and fear existed in their most concentrated forms. Parents who hadn't left their child's bedside in days looked up with expressions of surprise and gratitude as the princess approached. At bedside 7, 3-year-old Oliver Williams lay connected to multiple machines, his tiny body dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. His parents, Mark and Jenny Williams, had been maintaining a vigil for 2 weeks since Oliver's unexpected relapse. Jenny hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time, and Mark had taken indefinite leave from his job to support his family through the crisis. Catherine approached their small space with particular care, understanding that these parents were operating on pure emotional survival mode. She didn't attempt conversation immediately, instead simply sitting quietly beside them, offering the comfort of presence without the pressure of interaction. After several minutes, Jenny looked up with eyes that held months of exhaustion and worry. "Thank you for coming," Jenny whispered, her voice barely audible above the medical equipment. "It means more than you could know that someone like you would take time to be here with families like ours." The simple gratitude in her voice carried the weight of countless lonely hours spent hoping and praying in that small space beside her sons. Catherine reached out and gently placed her hand over Jenny's, a gesture that seemed to transfer some indefinable strength from one mother to another. "You're doing everything right," Catherine said softly. "Being here, loving him, not giving up. You're being exactly the mother Oliver needs you to be." The visit to the ICU lasted longer than anyone had anticipated, with Catherine spending time beside each bed, offering whatever comfort her presence could provide to families facing their darkest hours. As evening approached, Catherine and William prepared to leave the hospital, but word of their extended stay had spread throughout London. The crowd outside had grown significantly, transforming from the initial gathering of supporters into something that resembled a vigil of national unity. People had arrived carrying flowers, handmade cards, and signs expressing gratitude not just for Catherine's visit, but for her courage in sharing her own cancer journey with the public. The hospital's public relations team, initially concerned about managing the growing crowds, found themselves moved by the organic nature of the gathering. These weren't typical royal watchers seeking entertainment or photo opportunities. Cancer survivors had traveled from across the city to stand in solidarity. Healthcare workers from other London hospitals had come after finishing their shifts. Parents who had lost children to cancer stood quietly alongside those still fighting battles, creating an atmosphere of shared understanding that transcended individual experiences. Inside the hospital, Catherine was saying her final goodbyes to the young patients. Emma Rodriguez had insisted on walking with the princess to the elevator, her small hand confidently clasped in Catherine's larger one. As they walked, Emma chattered about her plans for when she finished treatment. She wanted to learn to ride a horse, visit the ocean, and maybe become a doctor herself so she could help other children who were scared about being in the hospital. "You know what I think, Emma?" Catherine said as they reached the elevator doors. "I think you're going to do all of those things and probably many more that you haven't even thought of yet. And whenever you're doing them, I want you to remember how brave you were during the hard times, because that bravery is going to stay with you forever." Emma looked up at Catherine with the serious expression that children sometimes wear when they're processing something important. "Princess Catherine, are you going to remember to be brave too, even when you're not in the hospital anymore?" The question, asked with such innocent directness, struck Catherine with unexpected force. "You know what, Emma? I'm going to try my best, and when I forget, I'm going to look at the beautiful painting you made for me and remember what you taught me about butterflies and becoming something beautiful after going through hard things." The elevator doors opened, and Catherine gave Emma one final hug before stepping inside with William and their security detail. As the doors closed, Emma waved enthusiastically, her yellow headscarf bright against the neutral tones of the hospital corridor. During the brief elevator ride to the ground floor, Catherine and William stood in contemplative silence. The day had exceeded every expectation, transforming what was intended to be a carefully managed return to public duties into something profoundly personal and meaningful. William watched his wife's face, recognizing the complex mixture of emotions he saw there. Exhaustion from the physical and emotional demands of the day, but also a renewed sense of purpose that he hadn't seen since before her diagnosis. The elevator doors opened to reveal the hospital lobby, which had been transformed once again. The evening shift of medical staff had gathered alongside the day workers who had stayed past their scheduled hours, creating an impromptu farewell gathering that filled the space with quiet energy. As Catherine emerged from the elevator, spontaneous applause began. but it was different from the typical reception at royal events. Softer, more personal, filled with genuine emotion rather than ceremonial obligation. Dr. Henderson stepped forward to offer final thanks, but his prepared remarks seemed inadequate for the moment. Instead, he spoke from his heart about what Catherine's visit had meant to his patients, their families, and his staff. "Your Royal Highness," he began, his voice carrying 30 years of medical experience. "In all my time working with seriously ill children, I've learned that healing involves much more than medicine. Today you brought a kind of healing that we cannot prescribe or administer. You brought hope, validation, and the powerful medicine of being truly seen and understood." Catherine's response was equally heartfelt and unscripted. "Dr. Henderson, I came here today thinking I was offering support to your patients and their families, but I'm leaving with so much more than I gave. These children, these parents, your incredible staff, you've all reminded me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about showing up and moving forward even when you are afraid. I've learned as much about bravery in these few hours as I learned during my entire treatment." As Catherine and William made their way toward the hospital's main entrance, they could hear the crowd outside, not the usual cheering and excitement of royal appearances, but something more like a gentle rumble of supportive voices. Hospital security had worked with police to create a pathway to their car, but the crowd's behavior required little management. People stood respectfully, many holding small lights or candles that created a warm glow in the gathering dusk. The hospital doors opened, and Catherine stepped outside to face the largest crowd she had encountered since her cancer diagnosis became public. The sight that greeted her was unlike anything she had experienced in years of public appearances. Thousands of people filled the street and surrounding areas, but the atmosphere was reverent rather than celebratory. Signs held messages like, "Thank you for showing us strength and your courage gives us hope." Near the front of the crowd stood Margaret Thompson, a 72-year-old breast cancer survivor who had traveled 2 hours by train to be present for Catherine's appearance. Margaret held a small bouquet of daisies, the same flowers she had carried during her own treatment as a symbol of new beginnings. When Catherine approached the barriers to greet people in the crowd, Margaret stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said, her voice shaking with emotion, "when you announced your diagnosis, you gave so many of us permission to talk about our own experiences. My granddaughter finally understood why I was so tired during my treatment, and my family stopped trying to pretend everything was normal when it wasn't. You made it okay to be human and vulnerable, even when you're supposed to be strong for everyone else." Catherine accepted the bouquet of daisies, but more importantly, she listened to Margaret's words with the same attention she had given to the children inside the hospital. "Margaret," she replied, "I think we've all been learning that being strong doesn't mean pretending we're not struggling. Thank you for sharing your story with me, and thank you for making the journey here today." The interaction with Margaret set the tone for Catherine's movement along the crowd barriers. Each conversation was brief but meaningful, with cancer survivors, family members, and healthcare workers sharing moments of connection that felt far removed from typical royal walkabouts. William followed closely, observing his wife's renewed energy and purpose with growing amazement and pride. As they finally reached their car, Catherine turned back toward the hospital and the crowd one more time. The building was lit against the darkening sky, its windows revealing the continued activity inside, the ongoing work of healing, hoping, and supporting families through their most difficult times. The crowd began a gentle applause that built gradually, not demanding attention but offering gratitude for a day that had touched something deeper than celebrity or royal protocol. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet, with Catherine and William both lost in reflection about the extraordinary day they had just experienced. The London streets, usually bustling with evening traffic and routine activity, seemed somehow different, as if the city itself had been touched by the emotional resonance of what had occurred at the hospital. Catherine held Emma's painting carefully in her lap, occasionally glancing down at the colorful butterflies that had come to represent so much more than a child's artwork. William broke the comfortable silence first, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and wonder. "Kate, I've watched you at hundreds of engagements over the years, but what happened today was something else entirely. The way you connected with those families, the way they responded to you, it was like watching something sacred unfold." Catherine turned to look at her husband, her eyes reflecting the complexity of emotions she was still processing. I went there thinking I was ready to return to normal royal duties, but nothing about today felt normal. Those children, their parents, the medical staff, they all taught me something about what real courage looks like. It's not about putting on a brave face for the cameras. It's about showing up authentically even when you're scared or uncertain. The car passed groups of people walking home from work, some stopping to wave as they recognized the royal vehicle. But tonight the waves felt different, more personal, as if the events at the hospital had created a new kind of connection between the royal family and ordinary citizens who understood struggle, resilience, and hope in their most fundamental forms. As news of the day's events spread through traditional media and social networks, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Television news programs abandoned their planned coverage to focus on what was being called a defining moment for the modern monarchy. But more importantly, personal stories began emerging from across the country as people felt inspired to share their own experiences with serious illness, caregiving, and the search for hope during dark times. Sarah Mitchell, a nurse in Edinburgh who had been following news of Catherine's cancer journey, posted a video message that quickly went viral. Speaking directly to her phone camera after finishing a 12-hour shift in her hospital's oncology ward, Sarah described how Catherine's openness about her diagnosis had changed conversations with her own patients. When Princess Catherine talked about her fear and uncertainty, Sarah explained, "It gave my patients permission to express their own fears without feeling like they had to be brave every minute of every day." Similar stories emerged from cancer treatment centers, support groups, and families dealing with serious illness across the United Kingdom and beyond. The hashtag #OsterCourageAndKindness evolved throughout the evening, becoming a repository for personal testimonies about the power of vulnerability, the importance of authentic connection during difficult times, and the way Catherine's journey had influenced their own healing processes. Back at Kensington Palace, Catherine sat in her private study, carefully placing Emma's painting on the mantelpiece where she could see it clearly. The butterflies seemed to catch the lamplight, their painted wings appearing to flutter in the gentle illumination. William joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea and settling into the chair beside her desk. "The palace switchboard is completely overwhelmed," he reported, his tone mixing amazement with slight concern. "They're receiving hundreds of calls and messages from people wanting to share their own stories or express gratitude for today's visit. The press office says they've never seen anything quite like this response to a royal engagement." Catherine sipped her tea thoughtfully, considering the implications of what they were hearing. Maybe that's because this wasn't really a royal engagement in the traditional sense. It was just people recognizing something in each other, connecting over shared experiences that transcend titles and protocol. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the study door. Private Secretary Simon Thomas entered with an expression of barely controlled emotion, carrying a tablet displaying news coverage from around the world. "Your Royal Highnesses," he began, his usually professional demeanor softened by genuine feeling. "I thought you should see how the day's events are being received internationally." The tablet screen showed news reports from major networks across Europe, North America, and Australia. Each story focused not on royal pageantry or ceremonial appearances, but on the authentic human connections that had unfolded throughout the day. Medical experts were being interviewed about the psychological benefits of hope and community support during cancer treatment. Child psychologists discussed the impact of seeing authority figures acknowledge their own vulnerabilities. Most remarkably, hospitals in other countries were reporting increased visits from local officials and community leaders who had been inspired by Catherine's example. The ripple effect of one princess choosing to return to public service by visiting sick children was creating waves of compassionate action across multiple continents. Catherine and William spent the evening reading messages that had been forwarded by the palace communications team, letters from cancer survivors, healthcare workers, parents of sick children, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been touched by serious illness painted a picture of a nation that had been deeply moved by witnessing authentic courage in action. One letter, from a man named Robert Chen, whose 9-year-old son David they had met at the hospital, was particularly moving. "Your Royal Highness," Robert wrote, "when you knelt down to listen to my son talk about Star Wars, you gave him something that no medical treatment could provide, the feeling that he was seen as a whole person, not just a patient. Since your visit, David has been more like his old self than he's been in months. He keeps talking about what you said about him being as brave as a Jedi, and I can see his confidence returning day by day. Similar testimonies filled page after page, each one describing specific moments from the day that had created lasting impact far beyond the immediate interactions. Parents described how their children had been inspired to engage more actively in their treatment after meeting Catherine. Medical staff wrote about renewed energy and purpose in their work after witnessing the healing power of genuine human connection. As the evening wore on, Catherine found herself thinking about the conversation with teenage James Morrison, who had challenged her directly about offering empty reassurances. His anger and honesty had pushed her to respond authentically rather than falling back on conventional royal responses, and that exchange had become a turning point in the day's emotional trajectory. The final message Catherine read before going to bed came from James himself, sent through the hospital's communication system. "Princess Catherine," he had written in careful handwriting, "I wanted to apologize for being rude today, but also to thank you for not getting upset with me. When you said it was okay to be angry about unfair things, it was the first time in months that I felt like someone understood what I was going through. I'm still angry about missing football season, but I'm not angry at everyone anymore. That's progress, right?" Catherine smiled as she read James's message, recognizing in his words the same kind of transformation she had experienced throughout her own cancer journey. The angry, frightened teenager she had met in the morning was already beginning to evolve into someone who could acknowledge his feelings while also recognizing growth and change. As she prepared for sleep, Catherine reflected on how the day had exceeded every expectation, creating connections and inspiring responses that reached far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring analysis, media coverage, and discussions about the future direction of her charitable work. But tonight she simply held onto the memory of Emma's painted butterflies and the profound truth they represented about transformation, beauty, and the courage required to emerge from difficult circumstances ready to fly. 3 weeks after the hospital visit, the full impact of that emotional day continued to reverberate throughout the country and beyond. Catherine woke each morning to reports of new initiatives inspired by her return to public service, new conversations about cancer care, and ongoing testimonies from families whose lives had been touched by witnessing authentic vulnerability from someone in her position. The Royal London Children's Hospital had received an unprecedented surge in volunteer applications from people wanting to contribute their time to supporting young patients and their families. Dr. Henderson found himself fielding calls from hospitals across the United Kingdom requesting guidance on how to facilitate similar visits from community leaders and public figures who had been inspired by Catherine's example. Emma Rodriguez had returned home the previous week after completing her latest round of treatment, her yellow headscarf replaced by the soft fuzz of new hair growth that she proudly showed to anyone who would look. The painting she had given to Catherine had been professionally photographed and was being used as the centerpiece of a new art therapy program at the hospital, inspiring other young patients to express their experiences through creative outlets. Maria Rodriguez often found herself thinking about the moment when Catherine had knelt down to Emma's eye level, listening with complete attention as her daughter explained the symbolism of butterflies and transformation. That interaction had given Emma a confidence and sense of worth that no amount of parental reassurance could have provided. She made Emma feel important, Maria told her husband one evening. Not important because she was sick, but important because she was Emma. The changes in James Morrison were perhaps the most remarkable of all the young patients Catherine had encountered. The angry teenager who had challenged her with his bitterness had gradually transformed into someone who was channeling his intensity into advocacy for other young cancer patients. He had started a blog called Real Talk About Treatment, where he wrote honestly about the emotional challenges of facing serious illness as a teenager, helping other young people feel less alone in their struggles. James's latest blog post, titled "The Princess Who Didn't Lie to Me," had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. In it, he described his initial skepticism about Catherine's visit and how her willingness to acknowledge that life could be genuinely unfair had validated his feelings in a way that changed his entire perspective on his illness and recovery. When Princess Catherine told me it was okay to be angry, James wrote, she gave me permission to stop pretending I was fine with everything that was happening to me. Once I could admit I was angry, I could start figuring out what to do with that anger instead of just letting it eat me alive. Now I use it to fuel my determination to get better and to help other kids who are going through what I went through. The ripple effects extended far beyond the individual patients Catherine had met. Cancer support organizations across the country reported increased membership and participation in their programs. The Teenage Cancer Trust noted a significant rise in young people reaching out for emotional support, many specifically mentioning that seeing a princess talk openly about fear and uncertainty had made them feel less ashamed about their own struggles. Catherine herself was experiencing a transformation that went deeper than simply returning to public duties. The connection she had made at the hospital had awakened something in her that transcended traditional royal service. She found herself thinking constantly about the families she had met, following up personally on their progress, and developing ideas for new initiatives that could provide ongoing support rather than one-time visits. William watched his wife's renewed energy and purpose with deep admiration, but also with the protective concern of someone who understood how much she had given of herself during her recovery period. You know you don't have to solve everything for everyone, he reminded her gently, one morning as she reviewed letters from cancer patients who had written to share their stories. I know I can't solve everything, Catherine replied, looking up from a particularly moving letter from a mother whose young son had been inspired by James Morrison's blog. But I can listen, and I can show up, and I can help people feel less alone. After everything I've been through, that feels like the most important work I could possibly do. The conversation between Catherine and William was interrupted by a call from Buckingham Palace. King Charles, who had been following the overwhelming response to Catherine's hospital visit with growing amazement, wanted to discuss the possibility of expanding her role in cancer-related charitable work. The monarch, himself a cancer survivor, understood the unique position Catherine held to provide hope and advocacy for patients and families dealing with similar challenges. Catherine, the king said during their private meeting later that week, what you accomplished with that single hospital visit has demonstrated something I think we're all still trying to fully understand. You've shown that the monarchy's greatest power might not be in ceremony or tradition, but in authentic human connection during times of vulnerability. The institutional machinery of the royal household was already beginning to adapt to accommodate Catherine's evolving role. The private secretary's office was working with major cancer charities to develop a comprehensive program that would allow Catherine to maintain ongoing relationships with patients and families rather than limiting her involvement to ceremonial visits. Palace communications staff found themselves managing a fundamentally different kind of public interest than they had ever encountered. Instead of the usual focus on fashion choices, royal protocols, or ceremonial appearances, media coverage and public attention centered on the emotional and therapeutic impact of Catherine's work. Journalists were requesting interviews with cancer specialists about the psychological benefits of hope and community support, rather than asking about upcoming royal tours or official engagements. The international response had been equally profound. Cancer organizations in other countries were reaching out to learn about the British approach to royal involvement in healthcare advocacy. Several European royal families had contacted Buckingham Palace to discuss how they might develop similar programs in their own countries. Emma Rodriguez's mother, Maria, had become an unofficial spokesperson for families who had been touched by Catherine's visit. She found herself fielding calls from journalists and researchers who wanted to understand the specific impact of the princess's presence on young patients and their families. People ask me what made Princess Catherine's visit so different from other celebrity hospital visits we've seen, Maria explained to a BBC interviewer. I think it was because she wasn't performing kindness or creating photo opportunities. She was genuinely present with us in our situation, bringing her own experience of fear and uncertainty into connection with ours. Emma didn't just meet a princess that day. She met someone who understood what it felt like to be scared about your body and your future. As autumn deepened into winter, the hospital visit that had been planned as Catherine's quiet return to public service had evolved into something much larger and more significant. Medical conferences were featuring presentations about the Catherine effect and the documented psychological and emotional benefits that resulted from her authentic engagement with cancer patients and families. Dr. Henderson had been invited to speak at medical conferences across Europe about what he had observed during and after Catherine's visit. His presentations focused not on royal protocol or celebrity healthcare advocacy, but on the measurable improvements in patient mood, treatment compliance, and family coping mechanisms that followed the princess's genuine, vulnerable interactions with his patients. The final testament to the lasting impact of that emotional day came in a letter that arrived at Kensington Palace 6 months later. It was from David Chen, the 9-year-old Star Wars fan who had been confined to a wheelchair during Catherine's visit. The letter was written in careful child handwriting, accompanied by a photograph showing David standing upright without assistance, wearing a bright red football jersey. "Dear Princess Catherine," David had written, "I wanted you to know that I remembered what you said about being as brave as a Jedi. Every time my physical therapy was hard, I thought about that and kept trying. The doctors say I'm getting much stronger, and I can walk to school now instead of using my wheelchair. I still have my lightsaber and I still think about being brave like you taught me. Thank you for helping me remember that even when things are scary, I can still be strong." Catherine read David's letter while sitting in her study, Emma's butterfly painting still prominently displayed on the mantelpiece. As she looked at the painted wings that had come to symbolize transformation and hope, she realized that the emotional day at the hospital had marked the beginning of her own metamorphosis from someone who had survived cancer to someone who could help others navigate their own difficult journeys. The nation that had initially been overwhelmed by witnessing Catherine's vulnerable return to public service had discovered something profound about the power of authentic human connection during times of crisis. The princess, who had been afraid to show her own uncertainty, had become a beacon of hope precisely because she had been willing to acknowledge that strength and fear could coexist, that healing was possible even in the midst of struggle, and that sometimes the most powerful thing one person could offer another was simply the gift of being genuinely present during their darkest moments.